The following video is sponsored by GroundNews. GroundNews are a website designed to help you find the news. If there's a story occurring, GroundNews gathers coverage of it from more than 50,000 sources worldwide. And then they break those sources down by the political leaning, the factuality as reported by 3 different independent rating systems, and even where they get their funding from. I've been using the site for a while now, and they're a great tool for finding stories both mainstream or otherwise. Take a look, for example, at this story from the other day. DRC is tangled up once again with mercenaries. See here, the different headlines, and on the side, 82 different sources, 74% of them have factuality, and here, the breakdown of who owns them. However, you take a closer look at some of these numbers, and you'll notice that there was almost no right-wing coverage, meaning that a good chunk of folk won't even be aware that this happened if they'd just done the usual morning news scroll. This is something that GroundNews tries to remedy, what they call the blind spot. They want to show people the other sides of stories and introduce people to stories and perspectives they wouldn't usually see. They even have a specific blind spot section on the website so that you personally can see stories you usually wouldn't. So, if you go to the link grand.news/MajorSamm, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which, as well as being a very good deal, gives you the full array of features. As someone who still pays for newspaper subscriptions, I can say truthfully that GroundNews is providing both a good and important service, and I hope you'll give them a look. At the beginning of September 1961, the Irish Army's 35th Infantry Battalion had been in Katanga for just over 2 months. Its presence making up a large portion of the United Nations operation in the Congo, whose primary mission was to maintain order while diplomats tried to talk the breakaway state of Katanga into rejoining the Congo. The majority of the ONUC were deployed in the capital of Katanga, Elizabethville, but smaller garrisons were scattered throughout the province. One of these garrisons, its callsign Force Meade, was stationed in Jadotville, a sizable mining town about 140 kilometers west of Elizabethville, populated by roughly 3,000 Europeans and 18,000 Katangese. After being in the town for only 3 days, Force Meade had abandoned Jadotville on 2nd September. They'd been sent into the town as part of Operation Rum Punch, the operation that cleared out a majority of the foreign officers that were serving in the Katangese Gendarmes, in other words the Katangese army. Their official task was to prevent any interracial violence that may have occurred when the Gendarmerie suddenly lost a good chunk of its leadership, though its real task was to impress on the Katangese that the UNO meant business. Almost immediately after Force Meade had arrived in Jadotville, made up 300 men from the Swedish contingent and the 35th Infantry Battalion's B Company, they'd been made aware by the civilian population that they were not welcome in the city. Their anger was backed up by the presence of almost 2,000 gendarmes spread across the surrounding countryside and camped out at the nearby Shinkalobwe mine, where they operated a training centre. The Swedish commander in Elizabethville had recognised that the men in Jadotville were completely outnumbered, and keeping them in the town was simply asking for trouble that they couldn't be expected to withstand, and so he ordered the withdrawal. Now, it's worth outlining here the structure of the ONUC, as the layers of bureaucracy within played a large part of what would unfold there over the following weeks. At the top, at UN headquarters in New York, Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld and his staff. Reporting to him from 10,000 kilometers away in Leopoldville, the capital of the Congo, ONUC headquarters, officer in charge was Dr. Sture Linner, a Swede, and Chief of Civilian Operations, a Tunisian, Mahmoud Kieri. Travelling between Leopoldville and Elizabethville was Force Commander Lieutenant General Sean McCoy of the Irish Army, as well as Hammarskjöld's special representative, Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien, also from Ireland. McCoy had under his direct command the ONUC formations in Congolese territory, the Ethiopians, the Malayans, the Ghanaians and the Tunisians, but he also oversaw Katanga Command. Katanga Command was based in Elizabethville, 1,500 kilometers and 2 time zones away from Leopoldville. In charge of all forces in Katanga was Indian Brigadier K.A.S. Raja, who commanded Sector A, containing the Indian Brigade at Albertville, Sector B, containing the Swedish Brigade in Elizabethville, and Sector C, containing the Nigerian Brigade at Kamina. Answering to the Swedish and Sector B was the 35th Infantry Battalion of the Irish Army, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hugh McNamee. Now, with this structure in mind, the following breakdown may make a little bit more sense. The withdrawal of Force Meade led to a meltdown at UN headquarters in New York when the news reached them with no warning, That's because word had travelled from the civilians in Jadotville to the leadership of Union Minière, who operated the mines in the town. Union Minière had contacted its leadership in Belgium, and they in turn contacted their government to protest the UN's lack of care for Europeans in Katanga. Then, furious, the Belgian foreign minister tried to contact Amersfoort, but only reached his staff. At no point was anyone in the Congo above the level of the Swedish Brigade headquarters aware of Meade's withdrawal. UN staff contacted McCoy, who in turn contacted Katanga Command. Katanga Command realised the size of the storm that was about to hit it, and told McCoy that Meade was still in Jadotville. Simultaneously, they made some very quick preparations to quote-unquote rotate Meade out of town. So, at short notice, and more out of desperation than a strategic sense, on the 3rd of September, A Company, 35th Infantry Battalion, was chosen to save face for the UN by reoccupying Jadotville. They simply were the closest unit that could be spared at the time. At midday on the 3rd, Commandant Pat Quinlan was informed, with no written orders, that he was to take his company and garrison Jadotville. Quinlan was a pretty standard officer. He wasn't outstandingly popular, but he certainly wasn't hated. If he had one defining quality, it was that he was extremely by the book. In the Congo, a lot of units found standards slipped a little in regards to training, due to the environment and the lack of danger. But A Company was kept at top condition, under the keen eye of Quinlan, and he demanded the same diligence from all his officers and his men. At the battalion command meeting, Quinlan made brief notes. His orders, as he recorded them, were: A Company was to move from Elizabethville Airport to Jadotville. It was unclear how long they'd be deployed there for, but if it were to be a long deployment, there would be a rotation of men. They would be joined by a liaison officer from B Company. Once in Jadotville, it was recommended that they contact Union Minière's security officer in the town, so he could act as a relay between the UN and the Europeans at Jadotville. Enemy strength was estimated as 160 in Jadotville itself, 1,600 at the camp at Shinkolobwe, and 300 in the town of Kolwezi, approximately 180 kilometers west of Jadotville. Transport to Jadotville and within Jadotville was going to be scarce, so they'd have to make the use of whatever could be scrounged, rented, or requisitioned in town. And finally, for support, they would be joined by a section of 2 armoured cars from the battalion's armoured car group. In his private notes, Quinlan would later write as the reason behind his orders: the Belgian foreign minister cabled UN New York to send troops immediately to Jadotville to protect the white population that were in grave danger of being massacred by natives. At this time, Force Meade had returned, and I was informed that the white population of Jadotville were apprehensive and had requested UN protection. So with the short briefing complete, Quinlan left and informed his men that they were to immediately begin packing to be ready to depart at 1300 hours. 35th Battalion HQ called for volunteers from the company's medical staff, and Private John Dreelan was chosen. He later recalled that the mission sounded like they were going on a nice trip, on a holiday type of thing, and he wanted to volunteer and go and see, not action, but just part of the countryside. At Katanga Command, Brigadier Raja protested the deployment of A Company, but was overruled by General McCoy, who that evening told Raja, "Do not, repeat not, withdraw UN troops from Jadotville without prior permission from this headquarters." Despite this, Raja still requested A Company be withdrawn as soon as possible. Connor Cruz O'Brien later wrote, "Raja could hardly be said to be seriously at fault. He had strongly recommended that no company should be sent to Jadotville, and had also recommended that the company, once sent, should be withdrawn. He was overruled by orders from ONUC headquarters Leopoldville, given by a teleprinter in my presence. A different type of commander might well have ignored risky instructions from on high, but this would not have been in Raja's character." The events of 3rd September and the deployment of A Company illustrated 2 of the ONUC's biggest failings. First, the lives of men were subject to the whims of political necessity, and the decisions of men thousands of miles away. Second, the physical move to Jadotville itself proved almost impossible at such short notice. To move 150-some men, A Company had at their disposal 1 stretched jeep, 2 regular jeeps, 2 civilian vehicles, one of which was a Dodge saloon car and the other a Floyd motorcycle, both rented by A Company from locals in Elizabethville. To compensate, the Swedish contingent had to loan a number of APCs and drivers so that A Company could be moved in 2 halves across 2 days. What should have been a simple act of moving a company down a highway took the combined effort of 2 different countries' armed forces. Despite the difficulties, the first half of A Company arrived at Jadotville later the same day. Their positions, made up of bungalows, small villas and a few commercial properties rented by the UN, were scattered along a 1,500-metre stretch of highway, about 2 kilometres outside the town itself. Quinlan later wrote, "As a defensive position, this certainly would not have been the choice of any commander, but on the 3rd of September the idea of having to go into battle in Jadotville did not appear to be a possibility." True to his nature and his training, Quinlan immediately ordered the preparation of defensive positions, something Force Meade hadn't done. Where they were, the area surrounding the highway was made up of the typical Katanga scrubland. The ground was made up of hard red clay and was coated almost everywhere in scrub and elephant grass, punctuated in places by trees. To the north, the scrub got gradually thicker and thicker before reaching a hill. To the east, visibility was barely 20 metres due to the thickness. To the south, once you got past the thick garden hedgerows, visibility was good for anywhere between 35 up to 300 metres before a dip in the terrain, where the ground only became visible again after about 1 kilometre. The biggest flaw in the position, however, came from the west, where Jadotville itself sat on a hill that overlooked A Company's positions. Company headquarters was established in the Pafina garage on the east end of the strip, with 3 platoon watching east and southeast, and 2nd platoon watching south. Headquarters platoon and support platoon watched the west end into Jadotville, and 1st platoon watched to the north. The company was spread pretty thinly, however, and there was plenty of spaces that couldn't be kept under watch at all times. What made them feel even more isolated was the state of the company radio. It was designed to operate at ranges of about 80 kilometres, but now was having to transmit about 144 back to Elizabethville. Through jerry-rigged antennas and transmitting at night for better atmospheric conditions, they managed to get a more reliable connection, but this meant they were almost constantly limited to communicating in Morse code, and even then, both A Company and 35th Battalion headquarters in Elizabethville spent most of the battle to come in the dark regarding each other. The rest of A Company arrived the next day, 4 September. With their arrival, this puts forces in Jadotville as follows: 155 men from 35th Battalion, 146 from A Company, 3 from headquarters, and 6 from the Armoured Car Group. Accompanying them as liaison officer from the Swedish contingent was 2nd Lieutenant Lars Froberg, who took the place of the B Company liaison because he could speak French. The following is their entire allotment of equipment. For transportation and support, they had the aforementioned light vehicles, one of which was mounted with a Vickers machine gun, and 2 Ford Mark V armoured cars, each also armed with a Vickers machine gun. The company, minus the armoured car section, was equipped with 64 FN FAL rifles, each with 100 rounds of ammunition, 78 Carl Gustav SMGs, each with 216 rounds, 12 Bren light machine guns, with 750 rounds ball and 75 tracer, 3 60mm mortars, each with 64 rounds high explosive and 16 smoke, 3 Carl Gustav 84mm recoilless rifles, each with 10 high explosive anti-tank rounds, and finally 2 Vickers machine guns, each with 3,000 rounds ball and 350 rounds tracer. In reserve, they had 12,800 rounds for the FALs, 16,848 rounds for the submachine guns, 5,940 rounds for the Brens, 192 rounds of HE and 48 smoke for the mortars, 30 rounds for the recoilless rifles, and 14,300 rounds for the Vickers. In addition, they had 170 blank rounds for use with rifle grenades and another 170 in reserve, 34 Energa anti-tank rifle grenades with 17 in reserve, 108 number 36 hand grenades with 108 in reserve, 5 Very pistols with 20 signal flares and 30 illumination flares, 20 and 30 in reserve respectively, 10 axes, 30 pickaxes, 5 crowbars, 16 pairs of wire cutters, 33 slashing hooks, 2 cross-cut saws, 5 handsaws, 20 shovels, 4 sledges, 20 steel wedges, 600 feet of rope in 50-foot bundles, and an unspecified number of sandbags. Missing from this list, however, were the 2 81mm mortars earmarked for A Company's deployment to Jadotville. When the support platoon arrived on the 4th, its commander, Captain Liam Donnelly, who had arrived the previous day with the advance party, was particularly upset to find the mortars had disappeared. In Elizabethville, the mortars had been packed, and they'd made it part of the way from the Elizabethville airport to one of the forward staging posts. There, they'd been ordered unloaded by an unknown officer, with the promise that they'd be sent on later. This was also the case for the company's entire supply of emergency rations. The disappearance of the mortars is made even more confusing by the fact that even Lieutenant Colonel McNamee believed the mortars had been aboard the transports with the second group, but now there were two missing 81mm mortars somewhere in Elizabethville. It goes without saying that when A Company completed the move to Jadotville, there wasn't much optimism for a number of reasons. The support company was furious that they lost the 81mm mortars. The rank and file knew something were up behind the scenes, because why else would they have been sent at such short notice, and at much lower strength than the force they were replacing. And most concerning was that this strong patrol, as Katanga Command was labelling A Company, was completely cut off from Elizabethville once they crossed the Lefera River. The Lefera River was probably the most significant obstacle for any occupation of Jadotville. It ran south to north, and it and the Lua Labyrinth feeds cut Katanga almost entirely in half. It's deep and it flows fast, meaning it couldn't be crossed by infantry without engineering support. And between Elizabethville and Jadotville, there were only a single road bridge and a single railway bridge. Upon crossing the bridge, one private, Frank McManus, had told his friend, "If anything happens, we're not going to get back out." And those words were apt considering that in short order, the Gendarmerie set up positions at the bridge and trapped A Company in Jadotville. Upon learning that the Gendarmerie had taken the bridge, Private Quinn later recalled, "You could see everyone's faces dropping, like everyone knew they were in dire straits. Because from once you crossed that bridge, you know it was only just a matter of time before we were killed or captured." In Jadotville itself, the only person who appeared optimistic was Commandant Quinlan, whose initial reports on 5th of September were recorded by Katanga Command as being that A Company was well received and all were quiet. From an objective standpoint, you were right. Two privates, Gorman and Stanley, had even gone into Jadotville off duty one evening, and other than a few hostile looks, they'd had no trouble. As soon as A Company was established in Jadotville, they began digging. The ground in Jadotville was so hard and difficult to construct trenches that even by the beginning of the siege to come, some men were still without fighting positions. These positions, once finished, were shored up with sandbags and timber cut from surrounding scrubland. Many were also covered in large amounts of bush to add concealment, making some positions almost invisible at a distance. Inevitably, this activity along the highway caught the interest of the local gendarmes, who began sending patrols to investigate. Because they were technically at peace, the Katangese would simply drive straight through A Company's lines, turn around, and drive straight back again. And as the days went on, the patrols became more and more frequent, leading to an incident where Private Frank McManus opened fire on a patrol that refused to stop. The gendarmes, though, quickly turned around and escaped unarmed. And now, with relations soured, A Company sent out a patrol of its own. Lieutenant Carey took 4 men in a jeep and made it as far as the railway crossing on the edge of the town, only a kilometre from the edge of their positions. There, they were stopped at a roadblock by a group of local gendarmes, led by a mercenary officer. Carey tried to explain to the mercenary that they were carrying out a routine patrol, but the Katangese didn't buy it, and Carey returned to A Company rather than risk a gunfight. One of the patrol members, Private Tom Gunn, later said that this was a signal it was getting a bit serious. Back within their positions, men also began to catch sight of gendarmes watching A Company, both from the north on the high ground towards the Jadotville golf course, and to the south, hidden in the dip in the terrain. Trying to get ahead of the situation, Quinlan met the mayor of Jadotville on 6 September. He found the mayor to be cold and formal and resentful of the presence of A Company, but Quinlan tried to explain that he was in Jadotville to maintain peace, wouldn't cause any trouble. The two agreed to keep a telephone line open for negotiations, but nevertheless, Quinn's report to Katanga Command that the situation was deteriorating would take another 48 hours to reach General McCoyne, who at this point was preoccupied with other problems that Quinlan had no knowledge of. Returning from the meeting, Quinlan ordered Lieutenant Joe Leach to take a large patrol to Colwezi. Leach took 1st Platoon and the entire armoured car section under Lieutenant Kevin Knightley, in total 1/3 of A Company, and they left the lines at 1320, but never reached Colwezi, returning by 2300. They'd made it as far as the bridge outside Colwezi, but had been stopped by what Leach called an extremely edgy and suspicious of UNO gendarme platoon manning a checkpoint. A Katangese second lieutenant told him that he would have to contact the local police commissioner to allow the patrol through, and after a brief conversation, permission was denied, and the patrol was turned around. The situation continued to deteriorate throughout the 7th. The locals were now openly hostile, and the residents whose villas A Company was staying in informed them that they were being told not to cooperate with the UN in any way. Private Teague Quinn recalled, "If you had a blunt knife, you could have sliced the tension." Quinlan drove back to Elizabethville to report the situation in person to Lieutenant Colonel McNamee and Dr. O'Brien, and explain just how vulnerable A Company was. He managed to speak with McNamee, who told Quinlan he'd speak to O'Brien and Brigadier Adger, but Quinlan received no further orders to return to Jadotville, most likely because O'Brien and Radger were now deep into planning Operation Morpho. With no orders coming, Quinlan ordered more defences dug, and for a party of men to go into Jadotville and stock up on whatever food could be bought locally. In his report to the Chief of Staff of the Irish Defence Force, Force Commander Lieutenant General McCoy reported, "The situation here is settled for the time being at least. That is, we don't have any serious situation on our hands other than some tenseness in Katanga." On 9 September, Quinlan made another attempt to impress the situation on his higher-ups. Captain Donnelly, Medical Officer Commandant Joe Clune, and Armourer Private Michael Dunn were sent with escort to Elizabethville. Donnelly specifically carried a message from Quinlan for Lieutenant Colonel McNamee, strongly requesting A Company be either withdrawn or reinforced, as their position was becoming more perilous by the day. It was suggested by Quinlan that an operation take place where a force would leave Elizabethville to take the Laferia Bridge while A Company cleared the gendarme roadblocks from the Jadotville-Elizabeth Highway. Quinlan later wrote to Donnelly, "My recollection of your journey to Elizabethville on 9 September is that I sent you specifically to explain our predicament and the hopelessness of our position at Jadotville to Lieutenant Colonel McNamee and to Cruz O'Brien, and to pass on my strong recommendation that A Company be withdrawn, as our stated mission was a complete misrepresentation of the true situation. The white people who we were supposed to defend were openly hostile to UN. If the company was not withdrawn, a new mission with strong reinforcements was necessary." McNamee seemed open to the idea and initially agreed with Quinlan's plan, but after raising it with O'Brien and Radger, it was quickly abandoned. Quinlan's orders were to hold on as long as possible without resorting to force, to stay put and all would be well. Donnelly recalled the lack of direction, information and material support from higher authority was difficult to fathom. In Jadotville, during the day, the gendarmerie was reinforced by another company, and in the evening, further checkpoints were established at either end of A Company's positions. The gendarmerie then moved to surround A Company and began to advance on them. After reaching a seemingly predetermined point, a whistle was blown and they withdrew. Quinlan ordered yet more defences dug through the night and raised the readiness of his men, ordering them to sleep fully clothed and equipped, with their weapons loaded and ready beside them. He then contacted headquarters, and on a radio call with McNamee once again requested strong reinforcement to be sent out to A Company, 2 platoons and 4 armoured cars, with 8-1mm mortars if possible. At 20:15 hours, they reported to Katanga Command that they were being surrounded. The following morning, Quinlan reported further developments. Katanga Command recorded 2 sections of gendarmerie had dug in at the level crossing about 1 mile from the Irish Company. 1 platoon of gendarmerie in houses at railway crossing in Jadotville. Report from OC A Company indicates that situation is not critical. Unconfirmed report that gendarmerie are handing out weapons to Africans. Commandant P.S. Wheatley at 35th Infantry Headquarters in Elizabethville recorded in his journal, "Last night A Company in Jadotville was surrounded by the gendarmerie. I suspect nothing happened. In any event, we are so well armed that we could not be taken by any force in the Congo." Isn't that a consoling thought? Of course, we are security conscious, but being so is in itself a strain, especially at our age. Behind it all is the feeling that we here are merely playing at war games, and that we could easily frighten ourselves just like children. At 1100 hours, a second mock attack was carried out by the Katangese. This time, A Company caught sight of them when they were about 500 metres away, and stood to, prepared for a fight. This time, the gendarmes advanced close enough that white mercenary officers could be identified, but no shots were fired by either side, and once again the gendarmes withdrew. In the early afternoon, Donnelly's patrol set out to return to Jadotville. Curiously, McNamee approached the 2 officers in the group, Commandant Clune and Captain Donnelly himself, and offered to let them stay in Elizabethville. They turned down the offer and left. They brought with them a Bedford lorry carrying rations and medical supplies and an escort from B Company and supported by armoured cars. Despite the reinforcements, the column was stopped at the Lefera Bridge by a platoon of gendarmes, about 30 strong. They all seemed very apprehensive and afraid of an Irish attack on the bridge. After brief negotiations, the jeep with the A Company men and the supply truck were let through. The rest were turned around. Between the bridge and A Company's position, they passed through 3 more roadblocks, each manned by another platoon. Unfortunately for the driver of the truck, a B Company man called Private O'Brien, he was now trapped in Jadotville alongside A Company for the duration, bringing the Jadotville garrison up to 157 men. At 0900 on 11 September, McNamee radioed Quinlan and assured him he was going to Mr. O'Brien and General Raja to get the Jadotville situation resolved and get the FCA to call off the encirclement. While it's unclear what efforts were being made, in the afternoon McNamee again contacted Quinlan to let him know he should expect calling off encirclement of your position soon, talks proceeding. The men in Jadotville weren't feeling particularly relieved though. They found the locals were no longer willing to sell them goods, and their headquarters kept receiving threatening phone calls. Meetings were being held amongst the civilians to rile up the rest of the population into rising up against the UN, but so far the escalation was still at a slow boil. Quinlan, though, seemed much better informed than the rest of the company, and it appears that at this stage he'd either made contact with a local Irishman who was willing to feed him information, or he had convinced his black houseboy, as he called him, to spy for him. As night fell, Quinlan had faith that things would be resolved by the ongoing talks. He reported it was tense, but not critical, and that the alarm was on and the situation was very dangerous. He also requested approval for an operation to remove the barricades from the highway, and effectively called the gendarmerie's bluff, but due to the ongoing talks, 35th Infantry Battalion denied it. In Elizabethville, Dr. O'Brien met with President Shomby. O'Brien thought it was best that A Company was withdrawn, as in his words, they served no useful purpose. It was suggested that Shomby was willing to lift what was effectively an hour's siege of the Irish position at Jadotville, in return for the UN abandoning the Elizabethville airport. This was a high price for the UN, much higher than the value of a single company. Negotiations continued. While things were quiet in Jadotville through 12th September, Quinlan was becoming increasingly nervous. This is best highlighted by a lengthy memo he wrote in his after-action report. I was very worried, and I smelled something in the air. I asked 3 times for information from battalion on the general situation, but the only reply I got was, "There is no news." I was on the C-12 by voice to Lieutenant Colonel McNamee and others at battalion headquarters a number of times on the day evening of the 12th September, but I was never given a hint of the planned action in Elizabethville the following morning. The orderly officer at Jadotville on the night of 12th September, Lieutenant Tom Quinlan, was on the wireless to Captain Stewart at Battalion HQ that night, and Captain Stewart was asked specifically for any information. The answer was that everything was normal. I am convinced that the staff at Battalion HQ were ordered not to give info on Morpho to A Company. Why, I can only reason that it was thought that I might take some action that would alert the gendarmerie. I now know, of course, that all at Elizabethville thought it would only be a couple hours' job, and that it would all be over. Had I been informed earlier of the Morpho plan, I would have known to expect the next morning, and I could have planned accordingly. I have no doubt that the final outcome would have been different, and A Company would not have been captured. The whole outcome of Morpho could have ended in success. Even the Irish government were becoming concerned for A Company at this stage. The Irish Department of External Affairs asked Hammarskjöld's military advisor for any information, but they were told there was no news about Jadotville. The Irish Defence Force Director of Operations cabled ONUC command directly and was told much the same. Nevertheless, Quinlan informed his men that something were occurring, and had his men take up their defensive positions, as well as prepare new ones away from the road that weren't as vulnerable to assault by vehicle along the highway. While the men dug in and prepared their equipment, Quinlan continued to request hourly situation reports from 35th Infantry headquarters. When the preparations were done, A Company now had a 3-tiered defence system. First, an artillery of Bren gun teams dug in amongst anthills and fortified buildings. Second, set further back in gun pits and trenches were the riflemen. Kept close to headquarters were the mortar teams, and inside the buildings that lined the street nearby, a final scattering of riflemen. 1st Platoon had the west end of the highway, 2nd Platoon had the centre, and 3rd Platoon the east end. Quinlan's plan, in his words, was to hit up all enemy formations and movements as far out as possible, and so break up his moves and demoralise him before he could even reach the start line for his attack. Sometime between 0700 and 0725, on the morning of 13th September, Quinlan received a radio message from headquarters in Elizabethville. Operation Morpho had been a success. Throughout A Company's position, the men went about as normal. A good deal of them were attending mass at the makeshift chapel located near 2nd Platoon's positions. At 0730, Sergeant John Moynihan was going to shave and was walking near the bus depot at the edge of the line, when he and others around the bus depot saw gendarmerie jeeps and a truck approaching from Jadotville. All of them carried infantry teams, and the jeeps had mounted 50 caliber machine guns. They pulled up close to A Company's positions, and some 20 to 30 gendarmes dismounted and began to advance. It's unclear who shot first, but very quickly the 50 caliber machine guns on the jeeps had opened up. Lieutenant Carey had been leaving A Company headquarters in the ambulance to alert the men that they should prepare for a fight, because of what was going on in Elizabethville. He turned onto the highway and saw the Katangese approaching, and as the first shots were fired, pulled up alongside the men at mass and began sounding the horn, as another man elsewhere let off a burst of machine gun fire to sound the alarm. All along the highway, A Company scattered into the trenches and the dugouts, as the men at the bus depot returned fire. Carey returned to Quinlan, who was already gathering his officers and issuing orders. He ordered Carey to set up a roadblock at the east end of the highway, and Carey got to work. The jeep with the mounted Vickers was parked across the road and reinforced with oil barrels, and covered by one of the Carl Gustav anti-tank launchers. As he and his men were finishing up, the first mortar rounds began to fall. At the business end, Sergeant Moynihan had dropped into a trench and took up manning a Vickers machine gun. Now, facing much heavier resistance than probably anticipated, the Katangese withdrew to their vehicles under cover and fire from the 50 cals, the mortars, and now additional heavy machine guns set up along the edge of the Gulf Coast Road. They remounted their vehicles without casualties and drove back into Jadotville. The whole fight was over in 10 minutes. In the quiet that followed, Quinlan ordered every container that could be found filled with water. In his words, "We filled every bath, bucket, bottle, and any vessel that could contain water." At 0835, Quinlan contacted 35th Infantry Headquarters in Elizabethville. Gendarmerie forces of an estimated strength of 20 attempted to rush our position. They opened fire, and we returned fire and drove them off. Much gendarmerie activity on our front and flank. We are holding our fire. I expect it is only the beginning. Estimated strength 300. Then he either contacted the Irishman or sent his houseboy into Jadotville to see if anything more could be found out about what was going on. The boy reported back, saying that the gendarmerie were waiting for reinforcements and preparing to attack around 11:30. Quinlan passed this on to headquarters. Big reinforcement gendarmerie expected 11:30 hours. Large-scale attack on my position expected soon after. Can you send reinforcements? While this was being sent, all around them, the men saw gendarmes getting into position, but Quinlan forbade his men from firing the first shot. And then, at almost exactly 11:30, the second attack began. First with mortars, backed up once again by heavy machine gun fire from the Gulf Coast Road. This bombardment was much heavier than the first, and many of the men became disoriented as they were deafened and the visibility dropped due to the smoke and the dust being kicked up. But as the men recovered from the initial shock and they got up in their trenches, they saw groups of gendarmes bounding towards them in small groups. The force that attacked that morning had been joined by some 60 to 100 more men, and they were now coming through the scrub from the direction of the Gulf Coast 300 to 500 metres away, while another smaller attack was coming from the south. Groups would rush forward, sometimes numbering as many as 20 to 30, sometimes as few as 3 or 4 or 5 men. They'd take up position, fire a few rounds, and then either withdraw or scatter into cover and concealment among the bushes. All the while, A Company's mortars chased the Katangese mortars. They managed to score a few hits here and there that would silence the team for a little while, but their best shot came when the Katangese were reinforced by a French 75mm howitzer. After it only fired 2 rounds, it was spotted by the mortar team and they hit the vehicle carrying its ammunition, putting the howitzer out of action for the rest of the battle. Lieutenant Knightley's armoured cars at either end of the highway also proved invaluable, as their Vickers machine guns could reach out all the way to the golf course and pin down the Katangese almost a kilometre away. Between A Company's mortars and the Ford armoured cars, at least 3 mortars were silenced, and many of the Katangese heavy machine gun crews were forced to withdraw out of effective range. 22 minutes into the fight, Quinlan sent a situation report to headquarters. "I've been fired upon and returned fire. Firing still in progress. Strength of opposition unknown." It wasn't long after that A Company had their first casualty, Private Bill Reedy. He was in one of the forward positions on the west end of the line when he took 2 hits to the gut. Luckily, the second hit skipped off the magazines in one of his patches, probably saving his life. By the early afternoon, the Katangese seemed to have had enough. There seems to have been no serious attempt to advance closer than 200 metres, and with casualties somewhere in the region of 1 or 2 dozen among the gendarmes, those still in the field either went to ground or withdrew. The second assault ended about an hour after it begun, and then throughout the afternoon the two sides settled into a strange rhythm. A section or a small patrol would come forward through the scrub, they'd fire off a few rounds and withdraw, or a mortar might fire off a few rounds and disappear again before A Company's mortars could fire back. For the most part though, the armoured cars would spot groups gathering on the edge of the golf course, massive for an attack, and scatter them with a few bursts. After another phone call, or another run into Jadotville by Quinlan's houseboy, Quinlan had an estimate that the force he was up against numbered some 600 men at least, but many of those were civilian militia, not gendarmes, and many of the whites they saw organising and leading attacks were not mercenaries, but the civilians that had wanted A Company out of Jadotville. The final major assault of the day came at 16:30, but petered out quickly. The attacking gendarmes advanced as far as the previous assault, and linked up with the men still camouflaged in the scrub, who had been providing them with supporting fire. Then, most of them withdrew. For the rest of the 13th, occasional harassing fire and the odd mortar round were all the gendarmes sent A Company's way. During one of these lulls in the fighting, Quinlan radioed Elizabethville to request reinforcements, as well as the 81mm mortars and more ammunition. He was unaware that help was already on the way. At 11:38 that morning, the call had gone out from 35th Infantry headquarters to pull 2 platoons and a support platoon from B and C companies to relieve Jadotville. By the time the last assault ended, the relief force was well on the way to A Company. 3 platoons from B Company had been pulled out of combat in Elizabethville, 5, 6 in support platoon. These men, aboard 5 trucks, a minibus, and supported by 2 armoured cars and 2 Swedish supplied and crewed APCs, were codenamed Force Kane, after their commander, 35th Infantry 2nd in Command Commandant John Kane. They expected to be in Jadotville early the next day. As night fell, Quinlan reported that A Company was still under mortar fire and expecting heavy attack at dark, though this attack never came. At 18:30 he reported, in touch with reinforcements, but reception poor. And then, at 19:40, he sent one more message. The gendarmerie has learned a lesson. Our morale very high. Everybody dug in. Hope you're alright, God bless you all. Unfortunately, what he didn't know was at this point Force Kane was facing heavy resistance at the Lafayette Bridge. After arriving around 18:35, they tried to rush the bridge with the armoured cars, but found the bridge blockaded with construction equipment and the Katangese waiting for them. While the armoured cars provided cover and fire, they alternated between trying to move the blockages off the road and blow them up, but with little success. All the while, the men took part in a heavy firefight. At 19:50, they made a second attempt, but in the failing light and with the men exhausted after being in combat since 0400 that morning, the order was made to withdraw out of range of the gendarmerie mortars at 19:45 and try again in the morning. As night fell in Jadotville, A Company began withdrawing themselves to new positions centered around the Pafina garage. This was for a number of reasons, but most importantly was the fact that A Company simply didn't have enough men to hold the entire stretch of highway, made even worse by the fact that, by this point, every single radio for platoon-to-platoon communication had failed, meaning that all messages were now being sent by runner. The new space was about 250 by 100 metres, with 1st platoon covering the entire northern arc of the highway, 2nd platoon watching to the southwest towards Jadotville, and 3rd platoon to the southeast. Their last communication with 35th Infantry headquarters for the day was at 2200, to let them know that had been contacted by the mayor of Jadotville. Quinlan had attempted to negotiate with the men, but was informed that there would be no negotiations between A Company and the Gendarmerie unless A Company surrendered. And so, aside for the odd angry shot, the night passed without incident. As dawn approached, however, A Company began seeing gendarmes moving into position, but outside the range of their weapons. The first attack of the day began at 05:30. This time, the gendarmes came in a single wave of roughly 50 to 60 men, and supported by the mortars and machine guns, but A Company's mortars and the armoured cars quickly broke up the assault at long range. A few groups, independently, managed to crawl up to within 150 metres of A Company, but were quickly forced back by concentrated small arms fire. The bombardment continued for about 45 minutes, before A Company's mortars managed to take out another supply vehicle, after which the armoured cars cut down the crews as they emerged from cover and retreated from the explosions. After this attack, the Gendarmerie changed tactics, and throughout the day their mortars would fire 3 or 4 rounds from one position before moving to another. While their accuracy decreased, they managed to harass A Company for most of the day, and even managed to wound Sergeant Agati before they gave themselves away and were caught in the open. For the rest of the day, and through to the end of the next, mortar fire from the Katangese almost entirely ceased. At 08:15, Quinlan sent his morning report, letting headquarters know that A Company could hold for another 24 hours. However, he requested permission to break out during the night and withdraw if the situation allowed. Permission was granted. Following this report, however, something unusual begins. In many cases, A Company's radio logs no longer match up with 35th Infantry Headquarters radio logs. Often, the 35th Infantry Headquarters has much more extensive and detailed efforts to assist A Company, while A Company insists they were left in the dark. By 08:30, fighting at the Lefira Bridge could be heard in Jadotville. Force Kane's second attack had commenced. It was much the same as the 2 attempts the previous night, but now they were on the receiving end of much more fire, as reinforcements had trickled in throughout the night, and they were much better coordinated in the daylight. By 09:30, the decision was made to fall back once again, and use the last of the mortar and armoured car ammunition to hit the defending gendarmes, now numbering at least a company, in hopes of putting a dent in their forces to relieve some pressure from A Company. The bombardment went on for 30 minutes until supplies were almost exhausted, and at 1100 hours, Force Kane turned around and returned to Elizabethville. Luckily, they had taken no casualties, but they had lost 1 truck. So far, 14th September had been a mixed bag. The Gendarmerie weren't making nearly as many attacks as they had the day before, and A Company had almost silenced their mortars, so the only thing they were facing was the occasional harassing fire. But on the other hand, A Company was still trapped, and it was getting decidedly worse. Around midday, the men heard an unfamiliar noise. They turned to the sky, and they saw a jet diving out of the sun towards them, a Fuga Magister. On the first pass, it didn't fire a shot. Quinlan ordered the first floor of the Pafina garage evacuated, as he thought it, being the tallest building they occupied, would be the most likely target. Then, at 13:30 hours, the jet came back around, swung low over A Company's positions, and opened up with its 7.5mm machine guns, and released 2 500-pound bombs, straight into the courtyard of the Pafina garage. The building was thoroughly riddled with bullets, and the bombs injured Privates James Tahaney and Edward Gormley. The jet came back around and carried out 2 more strafing runs, before leaving once again. But by this time A Company had made it to the trenches, and after the first run there were no further injuries. The final attack of the day by the jet came at 1500 hours. This time, Quinlan had prepared and had the armoured cars positioned where their arcs of fire could converge on the jet, and they opened fire as the jet began its attack run. This time, its 2 bombs hit along the edges of the highway, and it strafed A Company's trenches, but failed to cause any casualties. What its attacks did accomplish, however, was taking out every single vehicle A Company had available to it, including 2 buses they brought back with them from the bus depot when they repositioned. The only 2 vehicles left available to them were the 2 armoured cars. With the jets gone, the mayor of Jadotville called Quinlan once again, and demanded his surrender. Quinlan stalled and contacted Elizabethville to report the surrender demand, and asked in Irish for reinforcements, and declared his intention to hold on to the last man. While the large attack had seemingly been called off after A Company had hit it at long range that morning, by 1600 hours, small groups of Katangese had worked their way forward far enough to secure positions in the scrub close to A Company, and teams were even beginning to enter A Company's old positions. One gendarme sniper team took up position in one of the villas, only about 250 metres away from A Company, and began taking shots at 1st Platoon and Support Platoon. Captain Donnelly took a section and led a counterattack. The building was suppressed with one of the Vickers machine guns, and then an 84mm Carl Gustav round was put through the wall, and the building was cleared at range with small arms fire. Once the building were clear, the section moved on to take out a team of gendarmes in the scrub, only some 20 metres away. As they advanced, Private John Manning was hit in the right shoulder. As others rushed to treat the wound, Company Sergeant Jack Prendergast threw 2 grenades into the scrub position, clearing out the gendarmes. After this fight, the Mayor of Jadotville phoned Quinlan once again and requested a ceasefire to collect the wounded from the villa. Quinlan accepted, and shortly after, ambulances came out to collect the dead and the wounded. Immediately after they'd left, the harassing fire began once again. And then something bizarre happened. 1700 hours, a car approached A Company's position, stopped, and out got 2 men, Peter van der Wegen and Paul Peachin. Both were dressed in civilian clothes, but were carrying rifles and hand grenades. They surrendered to A Company when they realised where they were, and told them that they'd been travelling to Jadotville to watch over some Irish prisoners. Until the end of the battle, the Irish treated them as guests. In Elizabethville, Dr. Connor Cruise O'Brien were negotiating with the Katangese through the British consul, in order to call off attacks on A Company, threatening serious consequences for the Katangese leadership if they didn't. Meanwhile, Sector B Command was organising an attempt to resupply A Company. First, they considered airdropping supplies from C-47 cargo planes, but with the jet bombing the airport throughout the day, the plan were abandoned. In the end, it was decided to fly in water and ammunition aboard the single helicopter they could spare, while they put together a stronger relief force. In 1822, Elizabethville contacted A Company and let them know that they were putting together a plan to assist them. Katanga Command was now redirecting significant resources to assist A Company, and the staff went to work throughout the night. As night fell in Jadotville, the gendarmerie attacked once again. At this point, the Katangese probes were regularly getting within a few dozen metres, and combat was descending into vicious small arms fights, and both hand and rifle grenades were being used in abundance. It looked like there would be no breakout. The air attack and the close quarters combat had driven home just how bad things were getting for A Company, and while morale was still high, they weren't confident in their chances to hold out without significant support. At 0622, Quinlan put it in plain terms for 35th Infantry Headquarters. Position desperate, send reinforcements immediately, and 60mm mortar smoke. 43 minutes later, driving the point home by adding, "In the name of God, send reinforcements now. Promises of such are not sufficient." Before he got a response, the jet reappeared on the horizon. This time though, A Company had prepared to fight, but when the jet turned into its attack at 0730, it met what was described as a wall of fire, as all guns available were turned on the Fugger. They couldn't visually confirm they'd damaged it, but for the rest of the battle, the jet maintained a higher altitude, limiting its effectiveness. Then, at 0745, Quinlan got a call on the radio from Lieutenant Colonel McNamee, who didn't have any updates on reinforcements, but after hearing about the morning's air attack, ordered Quinlan not to surrender unless instructed from here. Quinlan assured him that they would hold out, and the call ended. The order not to surrender is only recorded on 35th Infantry Headquarters radio log, and not A Company's log. With words like surrender now being discussed, and the continuing air attacks, Force Commander Lieutenant General McCoy had taken an interest in what were going on in Jadotville. He passed on a message to Katanga Command to give Quinlan on his behalf. From General McCoy to Quinlan: "We all here admire and commend you and your men on your gallant stand. The whole UN force, our own people, and in fact the world are watching the outcome of your brave efforts. Inform all under your command that help is near, and that in the meantime, you have already earned for yourself the names of heroes." At 1313, 35th Battalion Headquarters asked if a breakout was still possible. Quinlan responded that it wasn't because of the number of gendarmes in Jadotville and at the Lefira Bridge. At 1550, he added that A Company had 5 injured. The afternoon of the 15th seems to mark the transition from battle to siege for A Company. Throughout the rest of the day, the gendarmerie didn't make any further attempts to assault the Irish positions, and instead dug in and subjected them to much heavier harassing fire that was joined in regularly by bombing and strafing attacks from the Fugger. the transition had begun the previous day, but it became the primary strategy by the afternoon of the 15th. Across the 14th and the 15th, they made at most 10 attacks. The largest on the morning of the 14th had no more than 50 or 60 men, and that was broken up before they came within rifle range. Instead, they were now moving exclusively in small teams that made heavy use of the available concealment to take up positions and suppress and successfully isolate the platoons. The men of A Company were now forced to stay in their trenches with little food, water and rest, and they could only get food and water after nightfall for risk of being hit during daylight. By the evening, the noose around A Company was tightening even more. 2 platoons of gendarmes were now moving in and fortifying the far end of the highway around the bus depot where A Company's positions had been at the start of the battle. In Elizabethville, Dr. O'Brien had been put in contact with the Katangese finance minister John Baptiste Kibwe through the British consul. At this point, most of the rest of the Katangese government had fled to towns still under gendarme control, rather than risk being captured by the UN. So, O'Brien tried to negotiate with Tshombe through Kibwe. In his words, to try calling off the Jadotville aggression. Kibwe seemed receptive and agreed to meet with Tshombe on O'Brien's behalf. By now, just about everyone from Katanga Command upwards was actively trying to learn as much as possible about the situation in Jadotville. Even the Irish government was making inquiries. The plan to rescue A Company was being finalised. In the evening, Quinlan called a conference at his headquarters. He had been informed that another attempt was going to be made to crack the Lefira Bridge. This was welcome news, but was dampened by the news from his platoon commanders that water, however, was now a problem, the supply having been cut to the buildings they occupied at the end of the first day. And they were desperately trying to conserve what they had. Food was also scarce. Despite this, though, all platoon commanders reported that morale was still high, but fatigue was also now a problem. As night fell, and well into the next morning, A Company watched as in the distance gendarmerie convoys and columns of men moved around their position in the direction of the Lefira Bridge. They made attempts to harass them with their mortars, Vickers and armoured cars, but the majority were well out of range and made it through. While it's unclear if A Company knew yet, as their radios failed for the rest of the night around 0:45, at 0:20 on the morning of the 16th, Force Kane 2 had been given the go-ahead. 300 men had been pulled from B Company, 35th Infantry Battalion, and the Indian 3rd Battalion, 1st Gurkha Rifles, were coming to rescue them. It wasn't until 06:35 that A Company finally received McCoy's message from almost 24 hours before. They responded immediately, "Many thanks to Force Commander," then continued in Irish, "We will stand to the last man, but send reinforcements now, and strong. Send water." The good news was that Kane 2 was already on the way, and even better was the news coming in that Tshombe had agreed to meet Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld in North Rhodesia to negotiate a settlement that would end Operation Morpho. Getting A Company out of Jadotville was one of his priorities, and he was meeting with the Irish Minister of External Affairs, Aiken, before he left Katanga to discuss Jadotville and how to end the siege. In Jadotville, at 09:27, a Sikorsky S-19 operated by the small Norwegian contingent arrived over A Company's position. Initially, there was alarm as the Fugger had flown over about only 20 minutes before, but it was quickly identified as friendly. A landing zone was quickly marked out for the helicopter, and it came into land, flying in so low that it accidentally scattered the camouflage off some of A Company's positions, exposing them to the gendarmes. Other positions close to the landing site were forced to be abandoned after they realised that they were too close and the risk of stray mortar rounds hitting the helicopter was simply too great. The landing itself, however, occurred without incident on the part of the Katangese, who waited patiently for it to land. In the cockpit, however, Norwegian Lieutenant Bjorn Hovden and his co-pilot, Swedish Warrant Officer Eric Fors, watched as the dashboard lit up with warning lights. Just like the B Company driver Private O'Brien, theirs would be a one-way trip, bringing the number of UN personnel in Jadotville to 159. Almost immediately after the helicopter had landed, the Fugger buzzed A Company once again, on its way somewhere else. The 2 crewmen were quickly rushed into the trenches, where Force took Lieutenant Carey's hand, announcing, "It's better than Dien Bien Phu." And again, with timing that usually only occurs in films and on television, the surroundings lit up. Every single gendarme who had spent the preceding 2 days of relative calm creeping into position began firing every available weapon at A Company. Small arms, grenades, all calibers of machine gun, and freshly reinforced mortar sections. Some were as close as 50 metres away, concealed in the scrubland. A Company fought back, returning just as much fire as they were receiving, as a group rushed to retrieve the supplies the helicopter had been carrying. The haul amounted to half a dozen jerrycans and a bag of post. The shooting lasted for 2 hours, then there was an uneasy pause for another hour, then it resumed for one last hour of continuous fighting. All the while, the Fugger made passes overhead. The fighting finally began to die down as the Katangese began falling back, some more organised than others. And though, while it seems like A Company had finally broken the backs of the Gendarmerie, they were almost entirely out of ammo, and worse, the armoured cars that had served as the linchpin of their defences were breaking down, their guns becoming inoperable after firing almost 20,000 rounds between the two of them, with almost no time in between for maintenance. A silence finally descended on A Company after 4 hours of battle. They realised something else was wrong. They couldn't hear any fighting in the direction of the Lefira Bridge. Force Kane 2 had left Elizabethville at 0650, the aforementioned 300 men, accompanied by a Swedish medical contingent and APCs, and 4 of the Irish armoured cars. To transport them all were a barely running collection of jeeps, supply trucks, and the majority of men were riding in 16 city buses with the windows knocked out. In all, the column were nearly 2 kilometres long, and as they left Elizabethville that morning, the BBC was kind enough to announce their departure to the world on the morning news. Progress were abysmally slow. They had to halt only a few kilometres down the highway when they ran into 2 civilians armed with handguns, who had to be taken back to a UN prison in Elizabethville. By 0745, they were only 6 kilometres outside the city, which is when the Fugger made its first attack, though luckily no one was hurt and they kept moving. At 10, they arrived at their assembly point south of the bridge, when they were attacked again. This time, Irish Sergeant Joe Gallagher was severely injured and had to be rushed back to Elizabethville, where he was then evacuated to a hospital in Leopoldville. Kane radioed Quinlan, "Can you break out?" Quinlan responded, "No, we have no transport." Kane, "Can you break out on foot and we'll meet you at the bridge?" Quinlan, "Bridge about 20 miles, men exhausted. We do not know force between here and bridge. Unable to take all ammo and supplies, this would be suicide. Only hope to remain here. You reach us." So Kane started preparing his attack. A platoon was sent forward on reconnaissance, supported by the Swedish APCs and the armoured cars, while he gathered his officers to make a plan. While set up watching the bridge, the reconnaissance platoon ran into some locals, who told them before they moved on that the bridge had been heavily reinforced. The platoon decided to carry on, and head just south once again when they started taking fire from the east, the same side of the river as them. The armoured cars moved up and suppressed the ambush, the gendarmes withdrew, and the platoon moved in pursuit, beginning a running gunfight along a bush road that led them through a small village where the platoon decided to break contact and withdraw back to the staging area. Between the ambush, the reconnaissance, and the intelligence the rest of the force had gathered, the picture that was being formed wasn't good. Not only was the bridge now reinforced, the gendarmerie had established small outposts and tripwire positions all over the southern side of the river, extending at least 1 kilometre, possibly 2, from the bridge. The only way for them to go was through. And while the reconnaissance platoon was gone, the jet had also attacked once again, taking out one of the jeeps but causing no more casualties. And then the gendarmerie opened up from the opposite side of the river. Some accounts even report taking fire from teams hidden along the railway embankment. With no more time to plan, Force Kane went into action once again. Most of the men took up positions in cover and began returning fire while the heavy weapons were set up, and then, with support from the 81mm mortars and machine guns, they made their attempt to storm the bridge. The Irish armoured cars took the lead, racing onto the bridge and attempting to ram the tractors, tree trunks and other construction equipment that were blocking it, while troops from the Gurkha Rifles followed closely behind. Though, with the obstacles refusing to budge and the withering fire from the opposite bank, the assault quickly began bogging down, and then the jet returned. As they withdrew from the bridge, the combined bomb attack, strafing run and infantry fire killed 2 Gurkhas and wounded 6 more. The second strafing run scored only hits on vehicles, taking out a bus and a truck. Once back in cover, the Gurkhas rallied and sat out to organise another attack. A group with just the essentials began moving through the scrub to the west, aiming to flank the Katangese, rush the railway bridge, and assault the force defending the bridge from the side. They made it through the scrub, but as they approached the railway bridge, it all went up in smoke. The explosion from the demolition could be heard all the way in Jadotville. So with the railway bridge blown and the road bridge impassable, the fighting died down. Force came pulled back. An engineering detachment was sent in to scout out some of the surrounding bush roads to see if any were passable. They weren't though, because the gendarmerie outpost covering the bush roads had gone to work making them impassable, and it would have taken at least 2 to 3 hours to make even a section of one passable again, with what they had on them, and they'd be under fire the whole time. And so, with things going from bad to worse, and no other way around or across the river, they contacted Elizabethville at 1630 to request orders. And then they began their withdrawal at 1905. But even then, the return journey proved difficult. The first couple of hours went smooth, even the jet was nowhere to be seen. But then, 12 kilometres from Elizabethville, both sides of the road erupted with fire, as gendarmes raked the column with machine gun fire. The column forced its way through even as the ambush grew in strength, and vehicles began running over mines and being hit by bazooka fire that ripped up the civilian buses. The spacing of the column, though, and the quick reactions from the crews of the armoured cars and APCs, meant that only a couple of buses were hit before the armoured vehicles had gathered at the site of the ambush, alongside a section of Gurkhas led by Naik Mahabir Thapa, who had already been wounded at the bridge. Recovering fire from the armoured vehicles, Thapa led his section into the scrub, trying to take the gendarmes by surprise, when he was hit by machine gun fire and wounded once again. With the fire now being concentrated on them, and the Gurkhas closing in, the gendarmes withdrew rather than face the opposition. Thapa's men established a rearguard as the column moved on, before withdrawing themselves. The ambush had wounded 5 Irish and another 5 Gurkhas, and Thapa would die of his wounds upon reaching Elizabethville. He would be posthumously awarded the Mahavir Chakra. Even worse though, in the confusion of the ambush, perhaps by driver error or perhaps by enemy fire, a truck in the Gurkha contingent carrying the mortar ammunition lost control and hit another vehicle. In the explosion and the resulting fire, 2 more Gurkhas were killed and another 10 wounded. By the time Force K2 reached Elizabethville, it had become the bloodiest engagement of Operation Morpho. 5 men were dead and 26 were wounded. The 5 dead were Lance Knight Kishan Singh Thapa, Signalman Kanshal Singh, Naik Mahabir Thapa, Subadar Jang Sahi Deb, and 1 unknown. After the morning's battles, Jadotville were quiet. Quinlan asked Elizabethville for an update on Force Kane. He was told, the reinforcements were hit from the air. They are heading in your direction now. They are not across the bridge yet. Then, around 1400 hours, Quinlan was phoned by the mayor, who passed the phone to a white gendarme officer. They wanted to discuss a ceasefire. Quinlan initially refused, saying he wouldn't negotiate any ceasefire unless the officer would meet him in no man's land. The officer countered by requesting ambulances be sent out first to recover any wounded. Quinlan refused. At 1500, the officer called again and told Quinlan he would order the withdrawal of gendarmes if he agreed to a ceasefire. Quinlan refused again and threatened to open fire on the scrubland if he suspected that was any movement going on at all. The officer offered to send other officers forward to gather the gendarmes and lead them out under a white flag. Quinlan agreed to this as long as they gathered at a specific spot at 1600 hours alongside the mayor and the officer in charge of Jadotville's gendarmerie to discuss further ceasefire terms. An agreement was reached. Quinlan contacted Elizabethville again for an update on Force Kane and was told that they had been ordered to consolidate their present position. The first officer to approach were a white man, and as he approached, the Irish opened fire on him, severing his leg with a Burston Vickers machine gun fire. He was quickly evacuated, and he survived his injuries, and he was the last casualty of the Siege of Jadotville. At 1620, the mayor, the officer in charge, and the white officer who Quinlan had spoken to on the phone appeared. Quinlan, A Company's chaplain Father Fagan, and Lieutenant Froberg, the Swedish interpreter, met them. Quinlan outlined 3 conditions for a ceasefire. First, the Fuga would be grounded. Second, the ceasefire would include the troops at Lefira Bridge. 3, any movement towards Lefira Bridge would be fired upon. The 2 gendarmes both claimed to not be in command of the force at the bridge, as they were from another unit. More importantly, Neither the Gendarmes or Quinlan had learned yet that Force Kane too had been defeated. The conditions, however, were accepted. The ceasefire that was agreed to was made up of 5 points, as written by Quinlan in his notes. A. Gendarmerie would withdraw from around my position to their barracks. B. A joint patrol of 10 Gendarmerie and 10 Irish would patrol the road area, which was hitherto no man's land. This was to impression the people that all was well and the fighting were over. A cordon of armed police, accompanied by some Irish troops, were to form a cordon between our position and Jadotville to keep back sightseers and other undesirables. The water was to be turned on to my position immediately. This, they claimed, would not be possible for some time as the pipes had been burst. They undertook to get a tanker of water conveyed to my position that night. The water was not turned on and the tanker did not arrive that night, but they did send me 30 dozen minerals to tide us over the night until water could be arranged in the morning. Police chief and assistant police chief, English speaking, were to tour the town and native compound with me at 10 a.m. on Sunday to assure everybody that all was well. In Jadotville, the men were ecstatic, better than they had felt for weeks. For the first time since the 14th, the men left their trenches in daylight. They opened the post that had come in on the helicopter and checked in on their mates from other platoons. After a small hiccup getting the joint patrol established, as Quinlan had refused to let white gendarmes take part, the Katangese finally entered A Company's position. Multiple times A Company men caught them looking around their position for graves, and when confronted would demand to know where their casualties were buried. It didn't take long though for the mood to lighten, and they later joined in a games of football between the two sides. In 1930, Quinlan radioed Elizabethville and informed them that he had negotiated a ceasefire after the mayor had requested ceasefire talks, and this would enable the resupply of food and water to A Company. He emphasised, "We have not, repeat, not surrendered." McNamee responded in Irish, "Congratulations, Pat. We place great trust in Aiken. He is on his way. Johnny is safe." But then the news broke. At 2100, Quinlan contacted Elizabethville again, asking for updates on Force Kane. He was informed now the greater part of the force is back. Quinlan told his officers, and they decided initially not to tell their men, in order to maintain morale. Then, for the first time in days, the men slept, though Quinlan made sure at least one man in every dugout remained on watch. On the morning of the 17th September, the men awoke to find that the Gendarmerie were once again surrounding A Company. Throughout the night, forces had been pulled back from the Lafira Bridge and brought in from Colwezi to reinforce the skeleton force keeping A Company trapped, and now they were both well and truly outmanoeuvred and under siege. There were at least some 1,000 or more gendarmes and militiamen in Jadotville now. Despite this, the men tried to look unbothered. The majority of A Company even went to Sunday Mass. At 08:05, Quinlan told Elizabethville that the water supply were now the biggest problem. The water in the jerry cans transported to them the day before had been contaminated by petrol that had been stored before it, and was completely undrinkable, and the water supply to the buildings still hadn't been turned back on. Quinlan warned that if he didn't get water soon, "I will have to give in within 24 hours, though that warning is only recorded in the 35th radio log. For roughly the next 2 hours, Quinlan stayed on the radio with 35th headquarters discussing the supply situation. Then, at 10, he decided to go into Jadotville proper to size up the situation and possibly get supplies. With him went Lieutenant Froberg, and the two returned at 11:55 with crates of beer. He resumed contact with headquarters and asked about a supply of food and water, and also asked about 3 jets that were supposed to be reinforcing the UN. He asked if they would break through to him, and at what time, and warned them that the ceasefire would risk it collapsing. "We are almost hostages." And finally, he asked for instructions, which 35th Infantry Headquarters passed on to Katanga Command by 12:40. At 13:06, Quinlan requested a decision be made before 1400, and reiterated his request for instructions, and stated, "Situation here out of my control. We are being offered accommodation in hotel with personal arms at 1600 hours. This is of course as hostages. We have no food or water in the situation we have at the moment. Decision Aiken and McCoyne." 35th Headquarters reported that Lieutenant General McCoyne was in Elizabethville and received their request at 11:32. There is no record of him issuing a response. Quinlan maintained contact with Lieutenant Colonel McNamee even after McCoyne's arrival, and the two exchanged a number of messages, some in Irish, as follows. 14:15, 35th Headquarters. Are you prisoners? Followed by a message advising that another helicopter was scheduled to arrive in Elizabethville that afternoon. No response from A Company. 15:35, A Company. There are no UN at the bridge, and there is a few thousand FCA around us now. The bet on a ceasefire was broken when the UN was not at the bridge. If another crow comes today, we are finished. They are around us on all sides. Get promise from Shombi about our care. The A Company radio log also includes the line, we are not to blame, someone must make a high settlement now. 15:55, Quinlan to 35th Headquarters. Let it be known to the world that we didn't give in. 4 days of fighting and threats of all sorts. They requested a ceasefire on the conditions sent to you last night. They broke the conditions. There are up to 2,000 FCA and paras around me now. I can't do any more without food or water, and the men are exhausted. The spirit of the men is great. This is God's will. 1600, or 1618 in A Company's log, McNamee to A Company. You have stood your ground for a week. They are terrified of you. Perhaps they may fire on you, but I don't think they have the courage to rush you. There are high settlements to be done. Soon there will be big support going to the bridge. The crows will be with us at first light. Send the other crow back. 1650, or 1715, Quinlan to 35th Headquarters. You don't understand the question. The crow can't go back. Help is too late now. I am trying to keep talks going. We are not in a defensible position now. I am trying to save my men. No food, no water. A Company log also includes McCoy's decision now. Written at 1718 but sent at 1740. A Company to 35th Headquarters. We have to go to the hotel. Personal weapons with us. There is no defence position here. We have no option now except high talk. Aiken McCoy's decision now. At 1700, Godfried Monongo, Katanga's interior minister, arrived in Jadotville. At his request, Quinlan went to meet him at the hotel he was staying in. With him, Captain Donnelly, Lieutenant Froberg, and Father Fagan. Monongo praised the Irish spirit and their performance as soldiers, but demanded A Company immediately surrender. He would allow them to keep their sidearms as a gesture of goodwill, however. Quinlan protested as there was already a ceasefire in effect, but Monongo issued an ultimatum: the A Company surrender or be annihilated. Quinlan had 2 hours. After returning to A Company, Quinlan called a conference. Quinlan was joined by Captain Byrne, Captain Donnelly, Captain McGinn, Commandant Clune, Lieutenant Leach, Lieutenant Quinlan, Lieutenant Carey, Lieutenant Knightley, Father Fagan, and Lieutenant Froberg. Lieutenant Carey remembered it as being very tense, as Quinlan congratulated the company for their performance, but the Katangese were now demanding their surrender. Each man present was given a chance to speak, and the response was mixed. Some wanted to continue to fight, while others agreed that surrender was the best option. Late in the afternoon, Quinlan returned to Monongo alone, signed a document to surrender. It read as follows. I, Commandant Patrick Quinlan, officer commanding Irish United Nations troops in Jadotville, do hereby agree to the terms of surrender of Minister Monongo because the Irish force is here in a peaceful police role. Any further action would result in the loss of African and Irish lives. I also wish to state that my troops fought only in self-defence, having been fired on while attending Mass on the morning of the 13th of September at 07:40 hours. It is also agreed that the Irish troops will have their arms stored at the location of the Irish troops' accommodation. In the absence of orders from a higher authority, I take the responsibility for this decision. A second document was also signed, giving assurances as to the safety of A Company. By this, the Minister of the Interior of the state of Katanga demands the surrender of the Irish soldiers and that they deposit their weapons into the hands of the Katangese forces. In return, the minister representing the Chief of State of Katanga assures the Irish soldiers that their lives will be safeguarded and that adversity will not happen to any of them. The essential condition is to put the weapons into the hands of our forces. P.S. The weapons in question will be guarded by us, of course. Monongo also reassured Quinlan after signing that A Company's safety was guaranteed, on pain of death to anyone who attempted to injure them. Despite Quinlan signing the document of surrender, some in A Company still wished to carry on fighting. Lieutenant Leach seems to have considered the conference more of a vote of confidence than an actual discussion, saying, Quinlan, and don't mention any of this, sign the ceasefire without consulting any officers. Lieutenant Knightley wanted to use one of the armoured cars to support a breakout by Lieutenant Carey and Lieutenant Quinlan's platoons, but in the end they decided that it would be disloyal and almost certainly would fail. At 1800 hours, Hammarskjöld left for Elizabethville, where he'd be informed by McCoy. It now appears the garrison at Jadotville has been overwhelmed by vastly superior forces. I shall tell you about casualties later. We have very little information as to what has exactly taken place since 1400 hours yesterday, but it would appear as if the company has been hopelessly outnumbered. The company has acquitted itself well during the week in a difficult situation. Hammarskjöld would then fly on to Ndola in North Rhodesia to meet with Tshombe, who now held much more power than he even held the day before. At 1900 hours, McNamee contacted A Company to alert them to the start of negotiations with Tshombe. The message ended in Irish, "Are you deserting the men?" Quinlan responded an hour later, "The last sentence of your message was not nice of you. We were surrounded for 8 days, with fierce fighting for 4 days. There was no food for 2 days, nor sleep for 4 days. There was no water. Is it worth your while to kill the men without cause? I frequently requested instructions today, but I did not get them." A second message followed. "I have surrendered honourably to Monungo. We keep our arms in hotel, regret that this was necessary." When the message was received in 35th Infantry Battalion headquarters, some of the men who had been in Force Kane cried. They responded in Irish to the message, "You have done extremely well. You have earned every military honour, all blessings on you all." At 21:20, Quinlan confirmed to 35th Infantry Battalion headquarters that they would remain in Jadotville carrying out joint patrols with the Gendarmerie. He referred to the surrender as a cause of heartbreak, but that the alternative was death by fighting or disease. He signed off asking for information on the outside political and military situation. 2200, A Company received a message relayed through the 35th Infantry headquarters from the officer in charge of Western Command back in Ireland. "Proud of your gallant stand. You are constantly in our prayers and thoughts." At 22:26, 35th Infantry HQ relayed a message from Sector B Command, praising A Company in Irish for the glorious stand they did. 35th Headquarters also informed them that Tshombe were meeting with Hammarskjöld in Ndola, but the situation wasn't clear. They also asked A Company later on for a message to give Radio Ireland to reassure the public at home. Quinlan's message, sent at 0:45 on the 18th, read, "Commandant Quinlan to Radio Ireland. Please assure our dear ones at home that all members of A Company and the Armoured Car Group at Jadotville are well and in high spirits. The 4 slightly wounded men are in absolutely no danger. The men fought a gallant fight, self-defence, against overwhelming odds. A ceasefire agreed to save loss of life. Families are not to worry. Safety of all is assured. Our thoughts and prayers are with you at home. We know your prayers saved our lives. We'll have love letters home soon. God bless you." At 0800 on the 18th of September, Lieutenant Colonel McNamee, Commandant Kane, and Commandant Condon held a radio call with Quinlan and Captain Donnelly. Quinlan, reportedly, explained the present position of A Company and how it came about, and asked to have messages sent home with reference to safety, health, etc. This was the last recorded transmission by A Company. At 0900, A Company radio log recorded, "Ordered to close down, dismantle set, A Company off the air, unable to inform headquarters because of communications." Throughout their position, A Company destroyed their weapons and equipment. An hour later, A Company left their positions for the last time. They were boarded onto buses and taken into Jadotville proper. Quinlan ordered his men to look their best. In the words of Private Tom Gunn, "We might have run out of ammunition, but there was still a bit of fight left in us." As they marched, one private, Butch Brennan, began whistling the Colonel Bogey March. The other men joined in. In total, the Siege of Jadotville had cost the lives of 5 Indian troops, and had wounded another 31 Irish and Indians. Casualties among the Katangese are not confirmed, and as the battle became more well known in recent years, the number has increased over and over again. The most likely number is around 150 dead. This number was given by Lieutenant Froberg, who said that of this, 7 white officers were among them, but perhaps as many as 30 whites were killed. The 150 dead, including the 7 white officers, was also recorded by Quinlan, as told to him by one of the white officers, who later retracted his statement. An Irishman who lived in Jadotville, the same one who had been passing information on to Quinlan occasionally before the battle, also put the figure at about 150. but added that there were at least 80 seriously wounded in the hospital at Jadotville, many of which weren't expected to survive, and at least 30 of the casualties were white. A later situation report reported that of the 80 wounded, around 50 were believed to have died, and 5 more bodies had been discovered in the bush from the retreat on the 16th. So in total, Katangese casualties probably amounted to some 150 to 200 dead, and most likely a similar number of wounded. Unfortunately, on his way to negotiate an end to the fighting in Katanga, Dag Hammarskjöld would die when his plane crashed outside Ndola. Fighting would continue in Katanga until midnight on the 20th when a ceasefire went into effect. A Company would remain in captivity until 25th October, when they would begin returning to Ireland in batches before the end of the year along with the rest of the 35th Infantry. Some, though, would even take part in fighting in December 1961. The question of blame is not something I want to go into. The aim of this documentary was to present the Siege of Jadotville from the perspective of A Company and the perspective of Force Kane, not dig into interdepartmental politics. The history is not as clear-cut as some sources like to present, and I hope I've spurred a lot of folks into looking deeper at the ONUC. A lot remains to be said about the siege. The lack of documents from the Katangese side, and the lack of accessibility to the original radio logs, means there's still much more we don't know about the battle than we actually do know. This, however, was my best attempt at summarising the battle in a good level of detail, with sources available to the public, and I hope all of you that have made it this far have enjoyed it. I apologise for any mispronunciations or mistakes I missed in my drafts, but I hope you'll forgive them as accidental and stick around for any future projects.